Hey everyone, it's Professor Clark, and today we have verbal adverbs. So we're going to take a break from participles and go into something that is similar to participles but much, much easier. So this should be fun and easy compared to what you just did. Let's start off by talking about what verbal adverbs are. So verbal adverbs, or depricastia in Russian, are also words that are made from verbs but give additional information about when, how, or why the action was done, like adverbs. So they're basically a cross between verbs and adverbs. Remember that participles are adjectives made out of verbs. Verbal adverbs are, as you might guess from the name, adverbs made out of verbs. And the exciting news is that just like any other adverb, verbal adverbs do not decline or conjugate. They do not indicate person, gender, case, or number, and they never change their endings. So this is an exciting exception in Russian grammar, and it makes them much easier to use than many other things. And remember that regular adverbs are formed from adjectives. So to make an adverb, we take an adjective, and then in Russian, it's normally going to have an o ending, like хороший becomes хорошо, плохой becomes плохо, and so on and so forth. However, with verbal adverbs, we take a verb, and then we give it the ending that indicates that it's a verbal adverb. And they can be formed from any type of verb: perfective, imperfective, transitive, intransitive. We can take pretty much any verb and turn it into a verbal adverb. And while verbal adverbs do not indicate tense, the unfortunate news is that they do indicate aspect. So we can form them from both perfective and imperfective verbs, and they maintain that meaning of aspect when they become verbal adverbs. And so we can't have past or present verbal adverbs, but we do have perfective and imperfective verbal adverbs. Let's start with imperfective verbal adverbs. And imperfective verbal adverbs are formed from imperfective verbs, of course, and they indicate action that is simultaneous with the main verb. So we use verbal adverbs with another verb, and this verbal adverb tells us something more about the action of the other verb. If we have an imperfective verbal adverb, it has the meaning of while doing something or by doing something else. So if we say something like, in English, they learned Russian by listening to the radio, in Russian we would say that with a verbal adverb of the verb listen. So они научились русскому слушая радио, for example. They learned Russian by listening to the radio. Or while doing something. For example, слушая радио, они писали эссе. While listening to the radio, they wrote essays. So how do we form these imperfective verbal adverbs? We start by finding the они form of an imperfective verb. For example, разговаривают, советуют, учатся. And then we replace the ending with я. Unless the stem ends in a husher, in which case the 8-letter spelling rule is going to come into effect, and we're going to replace the ending with a. So what we end up with is разговаривая, советуя, уча. And then we are going to add с мягкий знак, and it's always going to be с мягкий знак, never с я, to any reflexive verbs. So for example, учиться is going to become учас. An important thing to remember is that ava verbs like davat and vstavat regain that va in the verbal adverb form. So vstavat, они встают, but вставая. Давать, они дают, but давая. Узнавать, они узнают, but узнавая. And it wouldn't be Russian if there weren't some kind of an interesting issue around stress. So verbal adverbs, of course, have an interesting stress pattern. And where it gets tricky is with you have shifting stress verbs, both first and second conjugation. And in both cases, they're going to take their stem from the они form, but their stress from the infinitive. For example, писать is going to become они пишут, but the verbal adverb is пиша. Учиться, они учатся, учась. Просить, они просят, прося. Находиться, находятся, находясь. The exceptions, and this is a big exception, are the ova verbs, which take their stress from the они form. So рисовать, to draw, will become они рисуют, and then рисуя, drawing, while or by drawing. Танцевать, to dance. Они танцуют, танцуя, while or by dancing. Then we have perfective verbal adverbs. And perfective verbal adverbs indicate action that is completed prior to the main action. So they often have this meaning of having done something or after having done something, upon having done something. To form them, we find the masculine past tense. For example, написал, прочитал, открылся, вернулся, привык, лег, or постригся. And then if the masculine past tense ends in L, we just replace the L with a V. Написав, прочитав. If, however, the masculine past tense ends in L-ся, so it is a reflexive verb, we're going to replace that with вшис. В, ш, и, с мягкий знак. So открыться becomes открывшись. Вернуться becomes вернувшись. If the masculine past tense ends in a velar, like привыкнуть becomes привык, to get used to something, he got used to something, or лечь becomes лег, he lay down, we're going to add шы, ш, и. So привыкший, легший. And then if the masculine past tense ends in a velar plus ся, for example, постричься, to get your hair cut or to cut your own hair, он постригся, you're going to add шис, ш, и, с мягкий знак. Постригшись, having cut my hair. Some verbs of motion have their own special formation of verbal adverbs. And so iti verbs are going to be formed like imperfective verbal adverbs, even though they are perfective verbal adverbs. And so we will add ya to the stem of the conjugated verb to form a perfective verbal adverb. So пройти, они пройдут, пройдя. Прийти, они придут, придя. Выйти, они выйдут, выйдя. And then we have to do the same thing to form verbal adverbs from perfective verbs of motion with вести, везти, and нести in the root. Don't worry, we will learn all about these 2 chapters from now, I think. Well, we'll learn about вести, везти, and нести in the next chapter, and then the perfective forms with prefixes in the following chapter. Just take my word for it that these are verbs of motion, and we do the same thing. So привести, они приведут, приведя. Привезти, which is pronounced привести. Привезут, привезя. Принести, принесут, принеся. They are all formed the same way, where we add ya to the stem of the conjugated form, even though this is a perfective verbal adverb, not an imperfective verbal adverb. And finally, let's talk about stress, which is actually less bad than you might expect. So stress in perfective verbal adverbs is generally the same as in the infinitive, including, and this is the exciting part, in chats and nyats verbs. So начать, он начал, but начав. Начаться, начался, начавшись. Занять, он занял, заняв. Принять, он принял, приняв. If a yaw appears in the masculine past tense, it will normally be retained in the verbal adverb. So лечь, он лег, легший. Испечь, он испек, испекший. The exception to this rule are verbs of motion formed from iti, вести, везти, and нести, which we just learned about, with these forms of придя, приведя, привезя, and принеся. So there you have it, perfective verbal adverbs. The textbook has a lot of great examples and readings, so I suggest that you go over those to see how they are used. And hopefully you found that helpful and not too confusing. As always, you want to digest it slowly and in pieces. And for this chapter in particular, the most important thing is to do as much reading as possible and see how these participles and verbal adverbs are used in written Russian. So there we have it. We are finished up with that section of the chapter. We've got a couple more things to go over, and then we'll be done with chapter 7. I hope you are enjoying what is definitely an action-packed chapter, and we will jump on to complex constructions with to and kak and что next time.